Chapter 39. No matter what happens, I'm loyal to you. When I got home to Calgary, my doctor told me that my sore knee was serious. I needed surgery. They would have to do a scope and then shave the bone down in my knee, which could keep me out of action for up to 6 months. Even though I was protected by my contract in case of injury, I called Vince to let him know I'd do my best to be back as soon as possible. The week the surgery was scheduled, I was supposed to do an in-your-house match with Sid, but Vince told me Sid was injured too. He desperately needed me to do the match with Stone Cold instead, or the pay-per-view was in danger of bombing. Looking back now, I wonder about myself and my desire to please him at significant cost to myself. It couldn't have been all about being worried about my livelihood. Without hesitating, I told him I'd schedule the surgery for after the show. In less than a minute, we formulated a new storyline in which Steve and I would carry our war through in your house and onto Raw the next night, where we'd square off in a street fight. Steve would injure my knee, putting me out of commission. I'd have the surgery and do my best to get back for King of the Ring in June. As an incentive, Vince promised that if I came back in time, Shawn would put me over at King of the Ring. It was quite a thing to throw out to me, considering that Shawn and I hadn't sorted things out yet. Vince told me he was grateful for my dedication and that he, too, was fed up with Shawn. But he was reluctant to discipline him, maybe out of fear that Shawn would end up in WCW with his old pals in the clique. For my part, I offered to sit down with Shawn man to man and bury the hatchet, for the good of the company. I hung up the phone, relieved that everything seemed salvageable and that my position was still solid. During my match with Stone Cold on the April 20th In Your House pay-per-view from Rochester, New York, no fan could tell that my knee was blown. In a nice irony, I viciously worked Steve's knee, even ripping off his knee brace and bashing his unprotected joint with a chair. When I finally softened him up enough to go for the sharpshooter, I intentionally stepped through backwards so he could reverse it. Steve managed to reach back and find his knee brace and crack me over the head with it, gouging a deep, 2-inch cut in the top of my head. I fell back and my momentum flipped Steve perfectly up to his feet so he could step right into the sharpshooter. Feeling my scalp with my fingers, I knew I'd need stitches, and the last thing Steve and I needed right now was another bloody match. Luckily, the blood caked in my thick hair and was unnoticeable. By the end of it, Owen and Davey hit the ring to make the save, and I limped back to the dressing room leaning on their shoulders, which set the stage for a big blow-off the next night on Raw in Binghamton. The first thing I did when I got to the Broome County Veterans Memorial Arena on April 21st was ask Shawn to talk with me in private out by the ring, as a handful of technicians did sound checks. I told him I wanted peace. I didn't lay everything on him as being his fault, and listened without protest as he told me that morale among the boys was better when he was champion than when I was. I almost felt sad for him. He didn't seem to have a clue how wrong he was. Shawn said that his recent animosity toward me stemmed from my remarks about his knee, which he maintained was really hurt. What was I to make of that? Everybody in the dressing room was skeptical about his injury, so I referred to my own hurt knee and conceded that it was hard to tell from the outside just how damaged a knee was. Once again, we agreed that going forward, we would clear any negative comments with each other before putting them out there for the public to hear, and we'd work together as professionally as we always had, aiming for King of the Ring in June, if I could make it back by then. We shook hands and I felt good that we were back in sync. The street fight with Stone Cold on Raw built up like a showdown at the OK Corral. That night I sacrificed all I had for Vince and his company, determined to turn my knee injury into a positive. Even though Steve and I had fought it out numerous times before, I'd never been the despised one before. The crowd was as bad-tempered as a pack of vicious dogs. Coins bounced off my sore, stitched-up head as I headed out to the ring in blue jeans, a blue t-shirt and Doc Marten boots. It was impossible to wear a knee wrap under the jeans, so I went out without knee protection. Now the reluctant hero, Stone Cold, paced the ring in his black Austin 316 t-shirt and jeans, only to be pounced on by Owen and Davey at the sound of the bell. Shawn came to Steve's rescue, cleaning house all the way back to the dressing room, leaving me to deliver an intense shit-kicking to Steve, during which I methodically placed his ankle through the back of a steel chair and climbed up to the top turnbuckle. When I jumped off, Steve moved and I made out that I injured my knee when I landed. Of course, Steve promptly slammed my unprotected knees with the chair. We'd forgotten to calculate for no knee wrap damage and the pain were very real. It has given me pause to think that the knee problems I've suffered ever since were severely aggravated by this one angle on this one night. Then Steve twisted me into a sharpshooter and cinched it in until the New Heart Foundation, now including Brian Pillman, barged past several referees and agents to make the save. I was delicately placed on a gurney and stretchered out to a waiting ambulance with Owen and Davey shouting and pleading for the attendants to be careful as the camera crew followed us. I could hear Owen yell, "Watch his knee. Get him to a hospital," with such emotion that I almost cracked up. They lifted me into the ambulance, but just as it was about to pull away, the audience realized that Stone Cold was sitting in the driver's seat. It was an ambush. Steve scrambled back and put a vicious beating on me before he was jumped by Owen and Davey, and the whole ruckus was broken up by a gaggle of refs and agents. When the ambulance finally pulled away, a steaming Owen huffed to Davey, "He's not going to get away with this. We'll kill him. We'll kill him." I had knee surgery on Wednesday, April 23rd, spending one night in the hospital. I barely got in the door of my house the next day when Vince called and said he needed me to be at Raw in Omaha, Nebraska, on Monday. I told him that the doctor had warned me not to do anything, but Vince assured me that if I showed up, I could come out in a wheelchair, nobody would touch me. In real life, the other members of the Hart Foundation, Owen, Davey, and Pillman, were chomping at the bit to keep the momentum going, and I felt I would be letting them and the business down if I didn't show. The last turn of the screw? Jim would be there too. Vince explained that he wanted Anvil to come out in the final seconds of the show just as Stone Cold was about to get his hands on me in my wheelchair. Owen, Davey, and Pillman would all be preoccupied at ringside, and I'd be trying to fend Steve off with my crutches. Out of nowhere, Anvil would blindside him, and I'd whack him with my crutch, knocking him off the 10-foot-high stage. Steve would land on a giant stunt mattress in the dark, which would quickly be removed before the cameras found him sprawled out on the cement. Although I didn't relish making the trip just 4 days after major reconstructive surgery, I told Vince I'd be there, a strong feeling that Jim being hired back depended on it. So that's what I did. Over the next few weeks I came out in a wheelchair and then on crutches, for real. My heel turn and the angles it spawned were a huge success. We really had great heat. Vince's ratings were rebounding and the house show business was good, with Davey subbing for me in main events against Taker. There were all kinds of spin-offs involving the Hart Foundation that benefited not only Austin, but Taker, Mankind, Legion of Doom, and, of course, Shawn. It was great to see the whole dressing room working as a team to beat WCW. I worked TVs every week, ripping into America. Being a heel was fun, but I really feared where this was leading. The fans were so pissed off that I couldn't even hear myself talk when I did my in-ring interviews, though I couldn't have been more pleased when Meltzer wrote that my interviews were the best in the business all year. The Hart Foundation wore black leather jackets like mine, except for Pillman, who wore a black leather vest. The jackets served as protection from the constant barrage of dangerous objects. We were having such a successful and creative run that I even went to Vince one more time to see about bringing Bruce in as a heel World Junior Heavyweight Champion, the chance that Bruce had been waiting for all his life. Vince seemed to like the idea of revealing yet another secret member of the Foundation, which was really just the WWF's version of what Bischoff was doing with the NWO. Vince told me he was still hoping that I'd be able to work with Shawn at King of the Ring. My knee was sore and swollen, and my recovery slow. If I was working with somebody I could trust, I thought I might be able to pull it off. The question was, could I trust Shawn? What I should have been asking myself was, could I trust Vince? Raw, from Newark, Delaware, on May 12th, opened with the Hart Foundation at the top of the ramp, with me in my wheelchair praising them as the best that the WWF had to offer. They all seemed legitimately touched when I borrowed a couple of lines from the Sebastian Foxwar novel, Birdsong, to introduce them. I would take these men into the mouth of hell to fight the devil. I would trust these men to breathe for me and to pump my blood with their hearts. Jim the Anvil Neidhart, Davey Boy Smith, my lovable brother Owen, and Brian Pillman. We are the Hart Foundation. At the end of the show, with the idea that I'd soon be working with Shawn at King of the Ring, I called Shawn out to the ring. The last 30 seconds were supposed to be mine, and then Shawn would give me his super kick, toppling me backward, out of my wheelchair as the show went off the air. But the fan noise was so loud I couldn't hear my cue. Instead of the show ending with Shawn nailing me, we went off the air with me dressing him down. I felt bad about it, but Shawn thought I did it on purpose and was furious. I told him that they had the footage of him super kicking me out of my wheelchair, which they could replay all week on Vince's other shows. And they did, over and over. On May 19th, at Raw in Mobile, Alabama, Shawn and I built more heat for our King of the Ring match, but because my knee still wasn't ready and I couldn't go long, Vince's idea was that I'd promise that if I didn't beat Shawn in less than 10 minutes, I'd never wrestle in America again. A Hart Foundation member would be handcuffed to each ring post, and of course one of them would free himself to ensure that I won, just in the nick of time. During an in-ring interview in the first half of the night, Shawn was groggy and slurring his words. As I climbed into the ring with the Hart Foundation to open the second half, Shawn appeared on the big screen, wasted, and suggested on live TV that I couldn't get it up for 10 minutes and that I'd been having some sunny days, a blatant suggestion that I'd been sleeping with Sunny. I couldn't hear him well because it was so noisy in the ring, so the remark sailed right over my head. When the interview was over, most of the boys were seething at how unprofessional it was. Any hopes we had of working together went out the window. Sean was so out of it that night, Hunter and China had to help him out of the building. When I got home, Julie and Stu were upset about the Sunny comment, but it wasn't until Dallas and all his school pals asked me whether I was doing stuff with Sunny that I realized that Sean had hurt my family. At that time, the pro wrestling code of honor was still clear: no man hurts another man's family. Jim Ross phoned me at home to apologize on behalf of the office and to promise that Sean's unprofessional behavior would be dealt with. I'd heard that line before. This time I felt I had to do something to settle the score. Throughout that week I brooded about what to do. I wondered about beating the hell out of Sean for real at the pay-per-view, but that could be costly to the company if he got badly hurt. And I also had to be careful of my knee. I decided to tell Vince that I had to pull out of the pay-per-view because my knee wasn't ready. Vince had a plan: Stone Cold would finally catch me alone, flatten me and bash the hell of my knee, taking me out of the pay-per-view storyline and what would have been a clean win over Sean. At the Raw in Huntington, West Virginia, on June 2nd, I had an in-depth talk with Vince. He told me that the company was in financial peril and that he was only just hanging on. The next 6 months would either make him or break him. He said Ted Turner was hell-bent on putting him out of business, and he told me he might have no other choice but to restructure my contract. Of course, I'd still get every dime he owed me, but I'd get it on the back end, years down the road. He added that he appreciated how hard I was working for him and told me not to worry about anything. I sure didn't want to receive the money owing to me now at the back end of my contract, so I did call my lawyer to see what my options were if Vince tried to do that kind of a move, but when it came right down to it, I didn't believe that he ever would. King of the Ring went down on June 8th, according to the new plan. The next day we were all supposed to be at Raw in Hartford. Sean was nowhere to be found. I happened to mention to Jim that as soon as I saw Sean I was going to straighten him out once and for all. I never thought Jim the Anvil Neidhart could be a voice of reason, but he got a worried look on his face and pleaded with me, "Please, I just got back here. Don't do anything now. God, Rhett, I need this job. Just forget about it." What could I say? I resigned myself to not beating the shit out of Sean. About 6 p.m., I went into the bathroom to gel my hair before going across the hall to tape interviews. I was surprised to see Sean's reflection go by me in the mirror. I could see he was uptight, so I smiled and casually said, "Hey Sean." He cut me off. "Fuck you. You haven't talked to me in over a fucking month. What makes you think I'm gonna talk to you now?" Even though I had hair gel all over my hands, I was primed to go back to my original plan, but Sean vanished through the doorway, past Crush, who was lacing his boots up and heard the whole thing. I set out to find Sean, but he was gone. I paced around the backstage area until Owen, Davey, Jim and Pillman came to find me. "I know Sean's watching from somewhere, waiting for me to leave this room," I said. "I'll bet you the second I walk out of here, he'll walk in. All his stuff is in here. Watch." I crossed the hall, walked into the interview room and cracked open the door to peek back out into the hall. Sean strode past me into the dressing room. He was bent over fixing his boots when I marched straight up to him. I pushed him to his feet. "You got something to say to me?" He flicked a weak punch at me and missed. Balancing awkwardly on my good leg, I popped him on the chin, rocking him on his heels. He came for me, so I grabbed him by his long mane and pretended I was doing a hammer throw at the Olympics. I was dragging him around the room when a hysterical Pat and a frantic Lawler ran in and jumped on top of me. Unable to pry me off, Pat shouted for the other wrestlers to help, but Davey and Crush had no intention of saving Sean. It was nothing but a scratch fight really, but when we were finally separated, clumps of Sean's precious hair fell from my hands. I blasted him, "Don't fuck with me or my family, you little fucker." Sean looked ready to burst into tears as he stomped across the hall to Vince's office. Shouting loud enough for everyone to hear, Sean quit, saying it was an unsafe working environment. Then he stormed off, slamming doors behind him. Vince looked like a jilted lover whose boy toy had up and left him, but he told me that this had not only been inevitable, but was long overdue, and that it was his fault for not dealing with Sean sooner. He told me to take the night off. I felt silly to have come to blows over something so stupid, but while everything in wrestling was supposed to be bullshit, that bullshit was everything to me. Before Raw was off the air, Vince was hyping the inside story of a backstage brawl between me and Sean for sale to fans on his 900 number. My scuffle with Sean was the talk of the business. Meltzer wrote that I'd always been professional, and questioned the reasoning behind Shawn's claim that he couldn't trust or work with the Hart Foundation. Jack Lanza told me that Vince had known a real physical confrontation was coming before I did, because Shawn had told him he was going to punch me out as far back as May, at the Evansville Raw, but I couldn't tell if Jack was just trying to stir me up. I tried to put it all out of my mind, including Vince's talk about reneging on the financial terms of our contract, and did my best to heal up for the July in Your House, which was going to be in Calgary. I had two good distractions. Paul J. and his High Road Productions crew arrived and began shooting the documentary on me. And the Calgary Flames wanted to buy the Hitman. I knew a hockey organization such as the Flames were best suited to manage the team, and so I agreed to sell it. On July 3rd, Shawn agreed to come back. It's not like he had any choice. Vince had threatened to stop his $15,000 a week paychecks. I hoped the little bastard would finally straighten up, but I was thrown for a loop when Vince told me that Shawn was going to guest referee my SummerSlam match with Taker at the Meadowlands on August 3rd. Shawn would turn heel on Taker, costing him the belt. Though I'd finally get another stint as champion, a sour feeling ran through me. As heels we'd be in direct competition with each other again. One warm, beautiful night, Blade got upset while I was putting him to bed and started stomping around slamming doors. I finally picked him up and put him in his bed and told him to go to sleep. I was downstairs again chatting with Julie when Blade wandered defiantly past me wearing a Shawn Michaels t-shirt, hat and heart-shaped glasses, opening and closing his red leather-gloved fist. Julie and I struggled not to laugh. I coolly said to Blade, "Where are you supposed to be?" He put on his most serious face and said, "I'm with the Clique." Then he broke into a big grin and said, "Nah, I'm just bugging you, Dad." On July 6th, the day of the Calgary show, I headed down to the Saddle Dome early with Julie, our kids and their friends, with a High Road crew following us. Austin and Taker insisted that they not be filmed out of character, and I only had Paul J's word that I could ask him to edit anything out that I felt could hurt the business in any way. Paul's crew was so good at what they did that most of the time I forgot they were even there. I went over everything with Pat, putting the storyline and all the spots together. He wanted to involve my parents, Bruce and the rest of the Hart clan, who would be seated down front, right behind the rail. Owen would appear to be hurt and would be taken out of the match, only to return as the big hero and catch the fall on Steve after he had an altercation with Stu and some of the Hart brothers. This would be a huge night for Owen, setting up a big match between him and Austin at the SummerSlam. My anti-American rants had been going down big time with the Canadian fans. The Calgary crowd had shed its usual polite shyness and was ready to explode. Canadian flags waved everywhere. Owen, Davey, Jim and Pillman were pumped up and chomping at the bit, Ryan reminding me of a happy jackal who'd befriended a pride of lions. We did a live promo from the dressing room that played on the big screen in the arena, and the crowd response was so loud that the brick wall shook. Leo and I had worked hard at polishing up Shamrock, who was really coming along now and was pacing the dressing room anxiously. Goldust had a hot feud going with Pillman, and the Legion of Doom couldn't have been more pumped. Hawk came to me knowing that it was me and Taker who'd got LOD hired back. He awkwardly fumbled for the words to tell me that this time he'd give us everything he had, adding, "This match is for your dad." Besides Stu and Helen in the front row was Alberta Premier Ralph Klein. I was worn out, my knee wasn't healed enough to wrestle safely, and I knew it. My doctor warned me that it needed at least 3 more months, but I had to be there for Vince, not to mention that I'd waited my entire life for this night, wrestling at the top of my game in a really hot angle in front of fans who had been there for me from the very beginning. I was home and this was real. "Oh Canada," echoed majestically through the Saddle Dome, and then each member of the Hart Foundation made a separate entrance, first Pillman, then Anvil, then Davey, with Diana on his arm. After Owen proudly strode out, I stepped through the curtain and stood at the top of the ramp savoring the moment. There was no doubt that this was the loudest pop I'd ever heard. We'd touched a nerve across Canada, but for the fans in Calgary it went much deeper than that. They'd grown up with and stood by Stu's old Stampede crew through decades of highs and lows. And now we were squarely on top of the business, all of us like brothers. These fans were here to thank all of us, especially Stu. When I made my way to the ring, the explosion from the crowd gave me chills. The sight of the entire Hart family cheering in the front row, with a sea of fluttering Canadian flags behind them, made my chest thump like a war drum. I dropped down to the floor and carefully placed my sunglasses on my mother's head as she blushed. Stu smiled and winked at me. Stone Cold and I squared off in the center of the ring, nose to nose. From the second the bell rang, we set the pace for one incredible knockdown, drag-out fight that delighted fans on both sides of the border. Austin was loving being the hated heel again, every bit as much as I loved playing the hero. After Owen made an amazing Stampede Wrestling-style comeback, Austin cut him off and clotheslined him out onto the floor. Then Stone Cold jumped out and put the boots to Owen, in front of Stu and Bruce. When he rolled Owen back into the ring, Bruce threw a drink at Stone Cold's back. Austin turned around and jerked Stu to his feet by his lapels. The Hart brothers swarmed Stone Cold just in time. 19,000 screaming fans were about to do the same thing. Bruce was so mad about a couple of stiff shots Austin gave him that when I arrived to tip the balance and roll Stone Cold back into the ring, Bruce slammed a fist as hard as he could into Stone Cold's kidneys. Austin managed to pull himself up, only to be schoolboyed from behind by Owen. Bruce erupted like a tornado on the floor, taking on every heel in sight. When the referee made the all-important 3 count, nobody was paying attention to Owen because everyone was riveted to Bruce's unscripted comeback. Owen was furious at Bruce for stealing his big pop. Still, the Saddledome came unglued as the pay-per-view closed with Austin being wrestled down by various Hart brothers, agents, referees and Keystone Cop-like security guards, who handcuffed him and took him away. Hart kids swarmed the ring while Pillman and I went out and got Stu, whose knees were now so bad that we had to help him up the stairs. Jim Ross commentated, "The family that has fought together survives together," as the entire Hart clan celebrated in one last glorious whoop-up. Davey high-fived 12-year-old Harry, and Blade stood next to me, bouncing on the bottom rope. Ellie and her girls rejoiced next to Martha while Owen stood proudly in the corner holding Ouya, who twirled a tiny Canadian flag. I spotted some smiling kid in the ring and asked, "Who are you?" He excitedly said, "I just told them I was a Hart. Wave at the crowd and enjoy yourself." After the show, Bruce fell into a deep sulk because both Owen and I rebuked him for overdoing it on the finish. Sore as hell, I made the 3-hour drive to Edmonton alone, dreaming up my interview for Raw that night. I walked out wearing an Edmonton Oilers jersey just in case I needed to offset the long-standing rivalry between Calgary and Edmonton. It wasn't so much that I was anti-American, I said, I was just very pro-Canadian. I was soon shooting about sensitive issues such as gun control, healthcare and racial hatred, Canada coming out on the plus side of the ledger on all counts. I promised the fans that I'd defeat The Undertaker at SummerSlam and become the World Wrestling Federation champion for a 5th time. The only other 5-time champion was Hulk Hogan, and I wanted to tie his record before I ended my career. Steve could hardly work the Edmonton Raw because of his bruised kidneys. As a result, Vince put on hold any plans to go forward with Bruce joining the Hart Foundation. Over the next few weeks I switched gears from visiting sick kids at the Children's Hospital in Calgary with Owen to being spat on and pelted with garbage during a 4-day loop through Texas. We were extremely worried about Davey and Pillman, whose drug problems were getting worse. Owen told me that Davey was injecting liquid morphine. A few weeks earlier he'd tripped in his hotel bathroom and smashed his face on the bathtub, needing 16 stitches. Pillman did his best to hide the pain from his fused ankle, but anyone who took the time to notice realized that it was a brave and excruciating struggle for him to get in the ring every night. And the painkillers, washed down with alcohol every night, were getting the upper hand. I was doing my best to gingerly coax my own knee back, forcing myself to cut corners but still go all out, using more facial expressions in short heat spots. Every night Owen and I worked exciting but easy matches against Stone Cold and Mick Foley, who was doing an amazing job of handling 2 gimmicks at the same time, Mankind and Dude Love, a tidied, whacked-out hippie. When Owen and I arrived in San Antonio for Raw on July 14th, we made our usual visit to the Alamo. Owen had become my most reliable friend and supporter, and we ended up having an interesting talk about things worth dying for. We agreed that the wrestling business wasn't one of them. That night Sean and I saw each other for the first time since our cat fight. We were surprisingly cordial, yet neither of us offered any apologies. Once again we agreed to refrain from saying personal things about each other in our interviews and to leave each other alone, especially in light of the fact that we were both set to leave for a WWF-sponsored promotional cruise with a shipload of fans the following day. I tried to break the ice with Sean by telling him about Blade dressing up like him, and he laughed. In contrast to the week before in Alberta, Owen, Davey, Ryan and I walked out to a blizzard of spit and a hail of booze. Jim was briefly off, sorting out some contract problems arising from having signed with a small-time promotion before coming back to WWF. As I stood with the Canadian flag draped over my shoulders, each of the Hart Foundation members spelled out the conditions of our various SummerSlam matches. If Davey lost to Shamrock, he'd be forced to eat a can of dog food. If Owen lost, he'd pucker up and kiss Stone Cold's ass. And if Pillman couldn't beat Goldust, he'd wear his valet Marlena's dress. My vow? If I lost to Taker, I'd never wrestle in America again. I took some playful potshots about how the WWF should go back to Canada for the next Raw, where the girls were prettier and the beer was better, and I challenged any 3 Americans to a flag match. Though on the surface things looked pretty good, I was feeling more and more in the dark about where all this was going, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that something just wasn't right.